You know those scenes in fantasy novels, in period films, what have you, when the heroines are running around in a maze or a castle or a forest, and it's all so dramatic. I can't quite tell you why that particular setting resonates so much with me, but I can tell you an easy way to grasp that feeling, and that is a big cloak. Today's project is that exactly. I've been meaning to make a new cloak since my first attempt a few years ago, where I made an easy self-drafted Hobbit-style cloak. I'll leave the link in the description box in case you're interested. But today I want to make something more fantastical, with roots in historical fashion. Though I knew what feeling I wanted my cloak to grasp, I needed to do some research to figure out the best design and construction. And so I started digging into cloaks. Cloak is the word I have chosen for today's project, but there is a variety of words for outerwear that are similar to cloaks. So I pulled out my trusty dictionary of fashion history to differentiate between some of these terms. And you might be thinking, what does it matter what you call it? But having the right word means that when you're doing research, you can use the right terms to bring up the sort of results you want. You can search in museum catalogues, collections, and magazines a bit easier. So let's look at some definitions. The book defines cloak as, from Anglo-Saxon times onwards, a loose outer garment of varying length, falling from the neck over the shoulders. There are many different styles, and there are particular entries for different types of styles in the book. However, a cape is defined as from the 12th to the 14th century. It was also known as a cop. 15th century to late 18th century, it was a turned-down collar, whether large or small, but also a short-shoulder cloak. However, the former meaning of turned-down collar remained as a tailor's term in the 19th century. There is also a cape coat, a 17th century overcoat with a cape collar, a cape paletot from 1859 onwards, which is a sleeved cloak with a deep cape, known as Inverness, in the capot or capote, but also a regional traditional outerwear style covering from a zodge. These are just some selections from the cape-relevant definitions. There was a wealth of styles across regions, but it works to show that a cloak-style garment remained popular throughout the centuries. I also wanted to differentiate it from a mantle, a very common term when looking at 19th century outerwear. The word mantle actually was reintroduced from the French in the 17th century. In Old English, the word was mental. Again, I can't pronounce Old English. With many other variations to describe a long, voluminous cloak-like garment, typically full length and without hood. It was an everyday garment until the 14th century, when it became mostly ceremonial, worn by men, and fastened at the shoulder with 3 large buttons, though tied in front for women. It continued being worn, however, and in the 16th century, a double mantle. It referred to a lined mantle, a bit like the one I'll be making today. Stay tuned. By the 19th century, it became almost a catch-all term for a variable length outer garment, some with a single or several capes, and with or without sleeves. The two distinguishing features of my desired garment that make it not a mantle and not a cape, and therefore a cloak, are my exclusion of sleeves and my need for a hood. Though I doubt this cloak will ever really be worn as protection from the elements, I think a hood will add the needed touch, just for that little extra bit of drama. So now that we're armed with a little bit of history, let's look at the making plan. First, I had to decide on materials, and that was easy. I wanted velvet. Decadent, heavy, and warm, it was perfect for the drama I wanted for this project. However, I had difficulties picking a color because I think everything just looks so beautiful in velvet. So I ended up getting my top 2 colors. I got 5 meters of this beautiful red acetate velvet, which was actually upholstery velvet, so it had a good weight for a cloak and a short pile. I also got 5 meters of this beautiful polyester lilac, which is much lighter and has a looser drape. And here was the twist. I knew that if I wanted to use just the red, I would need to line it. And if I wanted to use just the lilac, I would need both interlining and lining to make it a suitable weight and drape. So a match made in heaven, no? And so the reversible velvet cloak was born. These are my materials, but I still need to figure out a pattern. For my previous cloak, I drafted it myself, and though that worked, I wanted to see what historical guidance was out there. I searched through my books for extents and patterns and settled on some guidance I found in Weinberg's Cloak, Skirt and Cape Cutter, one of your typical garment drafting manuals from the 19th century. This was published in 1897, and it's freely available online. I'll leave the link down below. Amazingly, it doesn't actually include any instructions to draft cloaks, though it is advertised in the title and the introduction, and instead calls these garments capes. There are 2 drafts, one for a short cape and a variation for one that goes past the waist. So I suppose we should get drafting.
Okay, so for the pattern for this cloak, I have found a historical draft that I quite like the look of, so I wanted to tell you about it. So this draft is from Weinberg's Cloak, Skirt and Cape Cutter from 1900. This is a one of those classic sort of Victorian draft and make kind of books, but it is freely available on archive.org, so I'll leave the link down below. The thing that I really liked about this cloak is that because, as I hopefully will have mentioned in the intro, there's a few ways on how to drape or draft cloaks and capes. One of them is that it's basically either a full circle, a 3/4 circle, a half circle, but that doesn't have any shaping. So that's just a circle or a part of a circle. And what you'll find is that actually your body doesn't really match a full circle exactly, specifically around here. So what I find is that when I've drafted cloak and cape types before and I've used like a circle for my neck, is that doesn't work because my neck is, the way my neckline sits is not even between the back and the front. And this draft addresses that. So what they recommend is that you use a well-fitting bodice pattern, but it doesn't really need to be well-fitting, but you use a bodice pattern that you have that is appropriate to the style of cloak that you want to make, in this case the 19th century. So I've picked my 1830s bodice, and the only reason for this is that it's a pattern that I remember fitting well, but it is a pattern with a high neck, I remember. Like it needs to sit up here, and this is a pattern that I could trust to do that. So I've got that, and I wanted to show you what it looks like on the paper and what they tell you to do. So the first thing they tell you to do is to make a line, and this is going to be sort of the half of the cloak. And then the next thing you have to do is you need to lay your back pattern piece and your front pattern piece up. So mine looks a little bit different from the image that they show, but basically you're meant to align the center back, which I've done here, and then you are meant to pivot it slightly, or as much as, they say about 2 inches, and it should come up 2 inches at the waist here, and then you have to line up your shoulder. So in the original pattern, they have 2 different ways, one for a short cloak/cape and one for a long one. I'm doing the one for the long one, and it does change the angle slightly. So what they tell you to do is to match up the shoulder as it would have been sewn, and then depending on whether you're doing the short or the long, you'll have to overlap either the front or the back. And then you just follow around and create your new center front by following your pattern. But as you can see, my pattern doesn't line up very well. And in the actual book, the neckline does look a bit weird, which is what I was saying, is that my neckline, if it's the perfect circle, it doesn't sit right around my neck because my neck is not even between, it's not a perfect half circle at the front and a perfect half circle at the back. So this kind of addresses that. So what I did was I traced out, this will be my center back line here. This is my center back neckline here. And this is my front neckline. I just traced out from this. And then I also marked the center front. And this is really interesting because my gut was telling me that I wanted a 3/4 of a circle cloak, just based on what I've seen. And this actually very naturally became a 3/4 circle. So if I cut this either on the fold or in 2 pieces, this will give me nearly a perfect 3/4 circle. Now, the only question about this is that, as you can see here, this neckline is super strange. I did follow the instructions here. They tell you to connect the front and the back with about a 3-inch gap. So I have done that. But because I don't really trust this to work out, or I can't really see how this is going to sit nicely, I'm going to make a short mock-up. So I'm going to cut out maybe 10 inches or so of a little full little mini cape, just to test out how this lays on the neck, and then adjust as needed. Now, when it comes to cutting this out, I've already measured how long I want this cloak to be, which is 140 centimeters. So that means that when I come to cut, what they tell you to do is that you need to pivot the full length from X here, which is in between A and B. So I will be putting a pin on X and a string that is 140 centimeters, or my tape measure, whatever you like, and then I'll measure 140 all the way around. I have a feeling that this is not going to fit on the width of my velvet. So instead I'm going to have to panel it, which means I'll have to have a seam, which I will probably make around the shoulder, because the other thing I have seen as well is that some patterns include, especially when you have to break them into several pieces, include slight shaping at the shoulder. So I might build that in as well because I quite like the look of it. So the first step now is really just to cut out this neckline and cut out a small mock-up of this, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so here is my mini cape mock-up. It is very scuffed, but it serves the purpose, and it has already told me that this neckline is too wide, as you can see here, and I'll show you at the back as well. There's too much space in it. So I am going to just adjust it so that I take, let's see if it, I think the back will be fine because the back of the bodice is fine here. Yeah. And then I can just adjust. So if the cape sat here and the shoulder sat here, I would like it to overlap and close at the front like this. I can just measure how much this has to come up by and change this curve here. That should be an easy fix. Okay, so I've just pinned on a little patch of fabric to correct this curve here, and now I'm just going to draw on the new curve that I want. There we go. I might even raise this. I don't want it to be too high, but I might raise it up to here. Then I'm just going to lay this, cut out the excess, lay this flat, and then trace it over my pattern to fix that curve. And then I think I'll just cut out the cloak. What could go wrong? Time for some floor time. So the only place in the house where I can cut anything big is the living room floor if I move everything out of in front of the sofa, which I have done. And I've laid out my velvet. So the first step is to try, so the way I'm doing it is there's only going to be one seam, which is at the center back. I'm not going to panel it because I luckily don't need to because I'm a short person. If you are taller than me, you might need to because the width of your fabric, unless it's extra wide fabric, may not be long enough to accommodate your sort of like neck to floor / desired cloak length. Mine is 140 centimeters, particularly for the lilac, which has no hem allowance. Thankfully it fits, which is great. And so I have just pinned my velvet selvage to selvage so that it becomes, I'm cutting it double. This here is the length of the fabric and this here is the width of the fabric. So I've now just positioned my shaping. So basically it's like if you're cutting a long circle skirt, you have basically the waist, which is the neck in this case, and then you're just gonna do the length out in a radius sort of way. So my the pattern in particular says to do it from X, which is a point on the shoulder. I'm not sure about that. I'm going to try it and then see what it looks like. But basically what I also recommend doing if you can is, so you have to spend a really long time trying to get your fabric as flat as possible, which I did. Something that I find really useful is that I often use my yardstick as like I lay it down on the fabric and then I push it around, and that really helps smooth out the fabric. The other thing that I often do is I have carpet in the house, which is very British. And so I usually pin through the fabric into the carpet, and that's really, really helpful. And also the carpet creates a natural friction against fabric to keep it in place. So I'm just going to show you what I'm doing so that you can see, in case this is your first time like swinging something out, because then this means that you can do it for any length. So you can see here my pinned fabric into the carpet. What I meant when I said about the stick is that I lay it here and then I just do this and like smooth out the fabric. And then I've measured from the bottom edge of the fabric this way up to the length that I want, which is 140 centimeters. And now I've pinned just the top edge of my sewing tape here, and I'm going to make sure that I've got 140 down and mark. If you were doing this as a circle skirt, you would be doing it like this. But my pattern, the draft, said to mark it from X, which is around here. So I might do that. I might just mark it going along the neckline at 140 and see what happens. Okay, so I've got the top of my tape pinned just here out of frame. I'm sorry, I can't get an angle with everything. But basically just to show you, so it's pinned there so that the top edge aligns with where the neck will be, not the seam allowance. And then I'm just gonna gradually swing it out and mark it at 140 every couple of inches until I can effectively have a cutting line that is 140 inches down from the neckline. You just keep going. You could do this with a yardstick. My yardstick isn't long enough, obviously, because it's just 1 yard. The other thing that people sometimes do is they use a piece of string that you can then pin at the pivot point and then do like wrap the rest of the string around here so that when it's taut it's 140, and then you just do that, which is also very easy, but I can't be bothered today and I've got my sewing tape here, so I'm just going to do this and continue all the way around until the center front. If your cloak needs a seam allowance or hem allowance, you can either add it to the measurement already so that when you mark it, it already has the seam allowance, or you can draw it on afterwards. It's a hood! I also wanted to add a hood to the cape because I don't think it's complete without a hood. But I wanted to show you what I did. So last time I made a cape cloak slash thing, the hood kind of came out a bit weird. I made it slightly too small. First I made it too big and then I made it too small. But this is based on a hood from an 1860s capelet that I made last year that I really liked. The pattern for that was based on a extant pattern from an 1860s magazine, and this is just slightly altered to fit this cloak a bit better. But the way it works is that it's basically a large rectangle that is then pleated to fit. So it's made of the same velvets as the cloak itself, and I actually ended up hand sewing it together first, and then I sewed it by machine across the seam allowance here. But because the seam allowance was really thick, I just zigzagged these edges together because this seam allowance becomes a channel. So I've also added, this is something that the magazine itself recommended in the very brief pattern instructions that they had, was that you can add a little bit of wire, they said, millinery wire, but I didn't have any. So instead I used a little bit of really thin and flexible plastic whalebone, synthetic whalebone. And this just helps the hood kind of keep its shape, especially with the heavy pleats and velvet. So yeah, I'm really happy with that. So the next step is really just to make sure that it fits into the neck hole and then set it in. I'm going to use the machine to set it in and then finish it by hand. And I'm going to do it in the same way that I've done jacket lapels before, or jacket collars, I guess, because that means that it'll be finished on both sides, and it'll be reversible like the rest of the cloak. So yeah, that's the goal. I'm looking forward to having this finished. I mean, the snow is all gone, so the dream of swishing in this in the snow, I mean, maybe it'll come back, but yeah, I'm getting closer to the final steps, so I think this is gonna be great. I also really like that it lets you peek a little bit of both velvets, worn both ways. So yeah, looks a little bit like a bonnet, but I love it. Okay, bye. So the cloak is pretty much done after, like, I think it must have been something like 4 or 5 hours of hand sewing the hem facing by hand, but that's only because I did trial the top stitching and I didn't really like it. So I hand stitched it, it looks really good. It was all done on the sofa, so there's probably no footage of it, but it was all just done with a little whip stitch, which you can only really see if you're up close. And as you can see, because it's curved, it did have to be eased in a bit at points, but I just did that not by running stitches, but just trying to like work the extra fabric in. But the last thing I wanted to do is I need to figure out a closure for the cloak, and originally I had thought I would use a clasp simply because it's so heavy, but I actually really like the idea of a big bow, even if I do like a bow that's mostly decorative and it has a secure clasp underneath. So for this is a sleeping Merlin. I've cut some strips of fabric and I'm going to make basically ribbons, I guess, so I can make big bows. But what I'm really proud of is that I managed to cut all of these lilac velvet just out of the scraps of what I cut off from the hem. I think that's really cool. Anyway, I have two things going on here. So I have one ribbon, which is going to be the lilac velvet, and then the lining of this really nice matching satin that I had just in my stash. I had 1/2 meter of this left and I just cut it into strip. And these are going to be sewn wrong sides together, then turned inside out, pressed really nicely, and then just secured to the red side of the cloak so that it ties at the front with a big bow. And then the other thing I have going on is that I have this wider sort of, I guess, strip of this matching satin, which I've interfaced, and this is about 5 inches wide because I'm going to sew it also right sides together, turn it inside out, and then I kind of wanted to turn it into a little like box pleated kind of thing, maybe going around the hood, and also then to tie into a big bow at the neck on the lilac side. So I'm going to put these up, make these into functional ribbons, and then maybe pin them on and see if I like it, and if I don't like it, we will pivot. But I think the cloak needs a little bit of decoration, just because it is meant to be like a practical garment, but it's also a very fantastical vibe to it. Like, it's so decadent with all this yardage of velvet that I wanted it to be a bit more, just more oomph. So yeah, let's add some trimmings, I think. And that is it. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions at all about the drafting or the making of cloaks, if you want to make your own, drop a comment down below and I'm very happy to help. And I'll see you all very soon.